In May of 1453, the walls of Segovia Cathedral witnessed a spectacle unlike anything medieval justice had ever staged: brazen, humiliating, and unforgettable. The hall was filled with bishops and courtiers in resplendent robes, but the witnesses summoned that day were not noble ladies or armored knights. They were women from the streets, figures from a world no respectable man dared approach without necessity. They had not been called to face charges, but to defend a prince. Their task was as strange as it was scandalous: to testify that the heir to the Castilian crown, Prince Enrique, was no stranger to masculine strength. Each woman was to confirm that she had spent the night with him and had never doubted his ability. At the same time, in a nearby chamber within the same building, an even more degrading ritual unfolded. Princess Blanche of Navarre, Enrique's lawful wife, was subjected, after 13 years of marriage, to an examination that branded her with shame. A group of noble matrons was ordered to inspect her body and deliver their verdict. The result shocked the court. After more than a decade of marriage, Blanche was still untouched. The scene that unfolded before Castile defied belief. On one side, prostitutes speaking of intimacy with the future king. On the other, his wife, forced before Europe to prove her virginity. And this was not happening in some provincial outpost, but in the royal tribunal itself, the very heart of Castilian justice, where matters of state, not of a marriage bed, were meant to be decided. Yet this was Enrique's chosen defense. He did not deny his failure as a husband. Instead, he made it part of his case. His explanation was extraordinary. With other women, he was free and capable. But with his wife, some unseen force robbed him of all power. Curse, sorcery, the shadow of an evil will. This, he and his advisors argued, was the only acceptable answer. The church even had a term for it: impotency ex maleficio, impotence caused by enchantment. But the dry language of the records fails to capture the horror of that moment. Outside the cathedral, whispers spread like wildfire. This trial would set in motion events that would not only destroy 2 lives, but plunge kingdoms into conflict, spark a battle for the throne, and bring forth new rulers whose names would forever be tied to the greatest upheavals in European history. To understand how one of the most powerful princes of the continent ended up in court, defended by prostitutes while his wife endured a test of her virginity, we must turn back the clock. Back to the day when the young heir first stood at the altar, as the royal court placed its hopes on a marriage meant to bring peace and unite 2 rival crowns. September 1440. The great cathedral of Valladolid glowed with candlelight, its walls draped in rich tapestries and glittering with jewels. The organ thundered as though heaven itself was blessing the union. Before hundreds of guests, the 15-year-old heir to Castile stood, slight of frame, awkward, his face already marked by the illnesses that plagued him since childhood. Chronic weakness, sudden mood swings, nervous frailty, none of it was hidden from the courtiers. But on this day, they chose to see only the brilliance of the future. At his side stood his bride, 16-year-old Blanche of Navarre. Educated, refined, raised in the traditions of the French court, she spoke 4 languages and carried herself as though born to rule. For her mother, the Queen of Navarre, this marriage was the crowning jewel of diplomacy, to unite 2 rival houses and shield her kingdom from bloody border wars.
The ceremony was presided over by one of Castile's most powerful cardinals. To all watching, it looked like the perfect game of chess, 2 crowns poised to merge into one. The cathedral was filled with nobles, clergy, and courtiers, and the marriage seemed like a promise of peace. But there was a second act to this story. The night when the marriage was meant to be sealed, not by words, but by action. In those times, a royal union was not considered complete until consummated. The bedchamber doors were left ajar. Bishops, doctors, courtiers, even jesters gathered just outside. Their presence was meant to guarantee that the marriage was confirmed. By morning, the proof was to be shown on the sheets, displayed as a symbol of the union. That night, they waited in vain. The hours passed, and nothing was heard beyond the heavy silence of the chamber. Morning brought not celebration, but rumor. Some whispered that young Enrique seemed paralyzed, that he would not even look at his wife, as though terrified of her presence. Others claimed the crowd at the door left him frozen with dread. When patience wore thin, physicians were summoned. Their conclusion was carefully worded. The marriage remained unconsummated. The Queen of Navarre tried to smooth over the humiliation, insisting the young couple only needed time. But soon she returned to her own kingdom, leaving her daughter in a foreign court filled with suspicion and intrigue. Within a year, she herself was dead, sudden and unexplained. Many said by poison, though no proof was ever found. Blanche was left alone, abandoned in a land where she would meet not compassion, but cold indifference. And in Navarre, her father was already planning new alliances, caring little for her daughter's feelings or her situation. From that moment, Blanche was no longer a bride, but a pawn. Years passed, and the strange union of these two young royals became a farce, an open secret at court. Enrique and Blanche lived under the same roof, shared ceremonies, banquets, and prayers, but their marriage existed only on parchment. They barely spoke, separated by a wall of silence that grew thicker with time. In public, they walked hand in hand. In private, they remained worlds apart. Blanche, raised in the refinement of the French court, tried to hold her dignity. Each morning she arose at dawn and went to Mass, praying for change, clinging patiently to the hope of a miracle. But no miracle came. Rumors of the strange life inside her marriage bed spread quickly through the court. Whispers reached the inner circles. Enrique was not avoiding women at all. On the contrary, his sudden disappearances and secret visits to the chambers of favorites became the talk of even the lowest servants. The prince's confessor urged him again and again to abandon such escapades and remember his wife. But his words fell into emptiness. Wine, music, and secret nocturnal visits filled the place that should have belonged to his queen. Everyone at court knew it. The guards at side gates were well paid to keep silent, and the servants had learned to look the other way. Desperation soon drove Enrique to stranger remedies. Italian physicians were summoned to Castile, promising cures for staggering sums. They brought exotic powders, tinctures from rare herbs, even ground rhinoceros horn carried by sea. The prince swallowed everything without hesitation, but nothing changed.
Next came the spices, chests filled with cinnamon, ginger, and the resin they called dragon's blood, praised as a miraculous cure. Enrique consumed so much of it that courtiers whispered he smelled like a spice market. And still, nothing changed. From desperation, they slid into cruel experiments. The doctors prescribed salves and tinctures that burned his skin and left him in agony. One time, he was so badly wounded by these treatments that he could not ride for weeks. Darker stories survive in the chronicles that Enrique would lie beside his wife while servants lashed him with whips, hoping pain might awaken what remained lifeless. For Blanche, this was humiliation beyond words. She endured in silence, hiding her torment behind a mask of royal composure. The young woman, raised in the polished courts of Navarre, was forced to suffer rituals that resembled torture, while smiling in public as if nothing were wrong. Yet during these years, something happened that transformed the perception of their strange marriage. In the spring of 1447, Blanche took a step almost unthinkable for a woman of her station. She appealed not to her husband, not to court confessors, but directly to the Pope. In her letter, still preserved in Vatican archives, her words were not cries of despair, but warnings. She wrote that she did not fear for herself, but for her husband's soul. For whispers in court spoke of dark rituals, midnight ceremonies, and forces that had no place in a Christian kingdom. That cry for help was ignored, or its answer was erased. Yet within months, the court magician was suddenly dismissed, his chambers sealed, and the objects found there burned in public before the watching nobility. Priests intoned prayers of exorcism as smoke rose over the flames. At last, an official explanation emerged. The marriage was under enchantment. To us, it sounds like myth, but in the 15th century, it was a convenient formula, one that spared the future king from the accusation of natural impotence. For the players in this drama, it meant one thing. Enrique had a legal loophole, and Blanche had her first signal that her fate would soon be decided not in the bedroom, but on the political stage. By mid-century, the political landscape around Blanche had shifted beyond recognition. Her father, King Juan II, had long shown that family ties were tools to be used. He had remarried, and his young son Ferdinand was being groomed for greatness. The daughter left behind in Castile, bound to a husband who had not touched her in over a decade, was no longer an asset. When open conflict broke out between Juan and his son Carlos, Blanche's own brother, Castile chose not the father, but the son. Suddenly, Blanche's position collapsed. Once a bridge between two crowns, she was now the daughter of a declared enemy. To ambitious courtiers, eager to remove a political threat, this was all the excuse they needed. In January of 1453, Enrique took the step long prepared. He filed an official request to dissolve the marriage. The grounds were ready: 13 years without a child, and whispers of a curse preventing the union. But words were not enough. Proof was required. The church demanded evidence, and that meant a public trial.
Spring 1453. A church tribunal convened in Segovia. Bishop Luis Vasquez de Acuña presided, surrounded by throngs of nobles who came not for theology but for spectacle. They said the cathedral had never seen such a crowd: grandees, bishops, curious young courtiers, all hungry for scandal. First, Blanche was led into the hall. She was 29, still graceful and dignified, but years of solitude and humiliation showed in her eyes. She was forced to remain standing, denied even a chair, as if to remind her she was now the accused, not the queen. The question was blunt. Did she swear she remained untouched? Blanche answered firmly. She swore it. But words were not enough. Before the watching court, the appointed matrons escorted her to a side chamber. What they did there is lost to detail, but their verdict was recorded. The princess was indeed still a virgin. Later, one of the women would write in her diary that the commission wept with bitterness as they witnessed her innocence. Then came Enrique's turn, and here the trial became theater. Instead of defending himself, the prince staged a show. Into the chamber came women whose names were well known: Mariela Flores, Catalina de Sandoval, Beatriz the Portuguese. These were not nameless streetwalkers, but celebrated courtesans, skilled in speech and well-versed in courtly intrigue. One by one, they declared they had lain with the prince, and that his strength was beyond doubt. One described markings upon his body that only intimacy could reveal.
Another produced documents proving she had been paid from the royal treasury, as if to show this was no secret but part of the crown's expenses. And the third delivered the fatal blow. She claimed Enrique himself confessed that with any woman he felt free, but with his wife it was as though chains bound him. The effect was electrifying. The hall fell silent, broken only by whispers. What had been a private tragedy was transformed into public theater, shredding the Queen's honor before all of Europe. Yet even that was not enough for the court. And then an unexpected witness appeared, the Marquis of Santillana. A respected statesman, he produced a letter from the physician who had treated Enrique for years. The doctor swore he had found strange markings on the prince's body. Quote, "Signs of sorcery," he wrote, "that appeared and vanished with the cycles of the moon." To modern ears, it sounds like superstition, but for judges of the 15th century, it was convincing proof. Barely an hour after deliberations began, the bishop returned with the verdict. The marriage was nullified, destroyed by malicious sorcery. Enrique was declared fully capable of marital life, and therefore free to wed again. The hall erupted. Some applauded, others sat in shocked silence at how far the trial had gone. Blanche simply bowed and left without a word. From that moment, her life no longer belonged to Castile, to Navarre, or even to herself.
When Blanche stepped out of the cathedral, her fate was already sealed. Formally, she ceased to be the wife of the Castilian heir. In reality, she had lost everything. The jewels she received on her wedding day were claimed by the crown. Her servants were ordered to pack her belongings. Her title dissolved with the verdict. She was left with only what she had carried from Navarre 13 years earlier. But returning home brought no salvation. In the summer of that same year, as she crossed into Navarre, she was met not with her family's embrace, but with her father's cold decree. King Juan II ordered her arrest. The official charge was correspondence with her brother Carlos, Prince of Viana, whom Juan considered an enemy. The truth was simpler. With her marriage annulled, Blanche had become the direct heir to Navarre, a threat to her father's plans and his new family. She was confined in the very castle where she had grown up. Through the barred windows of her chamber, she could still see the gardens where she once played as a child. Now she gazed at them as a prisoner, without a future. Her name became a pawn in other people's games, and even her own brothers and sisters were drawn into plots against her. Meanwhile, Enrique in Castile wasted no time. By summer, negotiations had already begun for his new marriage. The Portuguese court hesitated. The scandal of the Segovia trial had reached Lisbon. But eventually the terms were agreed, and by early 1454, the contract was signed. In May 1455, Enrique married Juana of Portugal. This time, everything was different. No crowds outside the chamber, no witnesses peering through doors. Only the couple and a trusted servant at the threshold. By morning, it was proclaimed that the union had been consummated. For a time, the court relaxed. Castile now had a queen, and the prospect of an heir seemed near. But the years passed, and no child came. Rumors stirred again. In foreign courts, Enrique was mocked as the impotent king. Castilian envoys abroad endured ridicule. Then, in February 1462, the court exploded with news. The queen had given birth to a daughter. She was named Juana. The celebrations lasted a week, and for the first time in years, the king appeared truly happy. But joy was short-lived. Whispers spread that the child's true father was the queen's handsome favorite, Beltrán de la Cueva. the timing matched, and his closeness to Juana was impossible to ignore. These rumors were not mere gossip. They struck at the very heart of the monarchy. If the girl was not Enrique's daughter, then her claim to the throne was nothing but a shadow. That shadow, in time, became the weapon his enemies would wield to bring him down. By 1464, doubts about the princess could no longer be silenced. Nobles who had once supported Enrique rallied under Juan Pacheco and demanded proof. Servants testified that the king and queen never shared a bed. Witnesses swore they had seen Beltran leaving Juana's chambers at dawn. The most devastating blow came in a letter from the Archbishop of Toledo. Spain's highest cleric declared plainly, he could not support Princess Juana's claim, for her parentage was in grave doubt.
Facing rebellion, Enrique made an unprecedented move. At the Cortes in Burgos, he publicly questioned his own daughter's legitimacy and disinherited her in favor of his younger brother, Alfonso. Even more bizarre, he suggested a solution. One day, Juana might marry Alfonso, binding her rights to his. But compromise did not bring peace. In June 1465, the rebels staged a shocking act of defiance. Outside the walls of Avila, they built a platform and set up an effigy of Enrique dressed in royal robes. One by one, they stripped it of the symbols of power, the sword, the scepter, the crown. Then they cast it into the dust and proclaimed a new monarch, 11-year-old Alfonso. Castile now had two kings, and the kingdom plunged into chaos. The struggle dragged on for 3 years, with neither side gaining the upper hand. Then, in 1468, everything changed suddenly. Young Alfonso was dead. The official story claimed illness, but many suspected poison. All eyes now turned to his sister, Isabella. Isabella, unlike Enrique, was decisive, patient, and shrewd. Support gathered around her, though she moved carefully. In September 1468, at Toros de Guisando, a treaty was signed between the king and his rebellious subjects. Enrique recognized Isabella as his heir, disinheriting his own daughter, Juana. In return, Isabella promised not to marry without his consent. But within a year, she broke that promise. In 1469, in secret, she married Ferdinand of Aragon, the son of the Aragonese king and the brother of the same Juan II who had once imprisoned Blanche of Navarre. That union would change history. The two strongest houses of the Iberian Peninsula were now joined as one. Enrique saw it as betrayal. He tried once more to declare Juana his rightful heir, but the tide had already turned against him. The name Beltran's daughter clung to the girl, while Isabella was increasingly seen as the embodiment of legitimacy and the promise of order. When Enrique died in December 1474, Isabella wasted no time. She immediately proclaimed herself Queen of Castile. But her claim brought war. Portugal rose in defense of Juana, and a brutal struggle for the throne began. Enrique's death opened a new chapter in Castile's history. Isabella acted without hesitation. Straight after the funeral, she proclaimed herself queen. But others were not ready to accept it. Supporters of Juana, daughter of Queen Juana of Portugal, proclaimed her the rightful heir. At their side stood King Afonso V of Portugal, Juana's uncle, who swiftly married his niece by church rite and led an army into Castile. So began the War of the Castilian Succession, a conflict that would decide not only who wore the crown, but the future of the Iberian Peninsula itself. The armies of Isabella and Ferdinand clashed with the Portuguese and Juana's partisans. Sieges gave way to open battles, truces to fresh assaults. The most decisive confrontation came at Toro in 1476. Both sides claimed victory, but in truth, it was Isabella and Ferdinand who emerged stronger, their authority solidified.
And yet it was not only swords that determined the outcome. Propaganda struck harder than steel. The whispers born years before in Segovia now returned as weapons. Isabella cleverly reminded all of Juana's cruel nickname, Beltran's daughter, casting doubt on her bloodline. In pamphlets and speeches, the message repeated, a child of uncertain parentage could not inherit the throne. Gradually, Juana's support withered. Even in Portugal, voices rose questioning whether the war was worth the cost. Finally, in 1479, the Treaty of Alcasovas was signed. Portugal renounced its claim to Castile, and Juana was given two choices: marriage to Isabella and Ferdinand's young son, or retreat into a convent. She chose the convent. Within those cloistered walls, she lived a long life, still signing her letters, I, Juana, by the grace of God, Queen of Castile. But beyond the cell walls, her voice was lost. In Castile, the power of Isabella and Ferdinand was now unchallenged. Their marriage had forged the core of what would become Spain, and from their union grew the empire that within decades would conquer the New World. But while Isabella and Ferdinand triumphed, the fate of Blanche of Navarre, the woman at the beginning of this chain of events, was far darker. After her annulment, her father held her in confinement for years. Attempts to marry her to French princes or dukes came to nothing. Blanche refused, knowing another alliance would only repeat the same trap. When her brother Carlos, Prince of Viana, suddenly died in 1461 during talks with their father, suspicion immediately fell on King Juan II. His death left Blanche the rightful heir to Navarre. The Cortes even proclaimed her queen. But her reign existed only on paper. Juan II stripped her of the title almost at once, transferring the claim to her younger sister Eleanor, Countess of Foix, who accepted in exchange for her own inheritance. Blanche was forced to sign a renunciation. Soon after, she sent desperate letters to her former husband Enrique, begging for protection. She even offered to name him heir to Navarre if he helped her escape. But Enrique did nothing. His own position in Castile was far too weak to intervene. In 1464, at the age of 39, Blanche died in the fortress of Orthez. The official cause was illness, but contemporaries whispered of poison. Her burial passed without honor, her grave left unmarked. The woman who once could have united two crowns vanished into oblivion, stripped of title, of family, and even of memory in stone. Her death was a warning. In a world where marriage was a weapon, a woman could be reduced to nothing more than a sacrifice on the altar of politics. And yet, Blanche's name did not vanish completely. It remained woven into history, not through power, but through tragedy, a prelude to the birth of a new Spain.
The triumph of Isabella and Ferdinand became a point of no return. Their union secured not only the throne of Castile, but a new order across the peninsula. Together, their marriage joined two great crowns, Castile and Aragon, along with their armies, wealth, and dynastic rights. From this alliance would emerge the Catholic monarchs, and with them, the Spain we know today. Victory in the Succession War gave Isabella legitimacy, but she also mastered the art of image. She cast herself as the queen who restored justice, ended chaos, and wiped away the scandals of the past.
In her propaganda, the story of Enrique and Juana became a symbol of shame, while she herself embodied purity and lawful order. Soon, that image worked beyond Castile. Isabella and Ferdinand crafted a foreign policy that turned Spain into Europe's center of gravity. It was they who backed Columbus's project, and their names that marked the dawn of the New World. Their heirs would finish the Reconquista, drive out the Moors, and raise an empire stretching from Granada to the Americas. And all of it began with the trial in Segovia, because a young prince failed to perform what was expected of him on his wedding night. A private failure became the spark of global history. The collapse of a marriage ignited the birth of an empire.